Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. We're going to be looking at creating and developing educationally meaningful and legally sound IEPs. My name is Cristina Barragan, and I'm from Let's Go Learn. And just a little housekeeping before we get started. You'll see that there is a bar on the right side of your screen, and there is an orange arrow button. That's your control panel. If you need to hide that so that it's not in the way, you can click it to hide the control panel, and then you can click it again to bring it back out. In addition to that, we will be answering questions at the end of the presentation, but I would also suggest considering waiting a few minutes before answering your questions or before entering your questions in the chat box, because sometimes the presenters do answer the questions as they present. But if they have a question that you have not heard an answer to yet, you can go ahead and put that in the chat box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll also be sharing a recording of this webinar as well as a PDF, so you'll have access to all of the content on demand after the session. A transcribed version is also available upon request. And so now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest today. So we have Dr. Mitchell Yell, and he is a professor, legal author, and board member of the Council of Exceptional Children. And he is also a Fred and Frances Lester Palmetto Chair in Teacher Education. He is author of several textbooks in special education and the law. And we also have Dr. Kurt Hewitt. So Kurt Hewitt is a National Director of Special Education Services. He is a legal author as well with legal aspects of special education, and he's a lifelong advocate for children with special education needs and disabilities. A little preview of what we'll be doing today. We just looked at some introductions to our team. We'll also be having a legal discussion with Dr. Yell. At the end, there will be time for Q&A from the audience, and then we'll also have time to go into some Let's Go Learn highlights, which will be an optional preview if you'd like to stay and attend. So to get started, I would like to send out a little poll question just to see who we have here with us today. So the first poll question that will be appearing on your screen is, what is your current role within your organization? So I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to answer that, or a couple of seconds, so that we can get some idea of who is here. If we have SPED directors, general administrators, teachers, SPED administrators, and consultants or others. Okay, great. So it looks like we have the largest percent with special education administrators. And then I also would like to find out, why are you attending today? So you'll have a poll come up on your screen now. Do you have immediate concern about your organization's IEP legal compliance? Are you looking at long-term initiatives to improve IEP compliance? Do you just have a desire to improve educational outcomes for students, or are you just looking for general information? So we'll go ahead and give you some time to answer that poll. Great. I'm going to go ahead and close that out. And it looks like the majority of you have a desire to improve educational outcomes for your students, which is great. I think that's something we all have in common here. So now, without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Kurt Hewitt.
Hey everybody, great to be with you today. Couldn't be more excited to be here speaking with Dr. Yell. Like many of you, I grew up professionally reading Dr. Yell's materials and books, and I've been studying his work for over 20 years now. It's hard to believe. But one of the things I love about Dr. Yell's approach is he was a former special education teacher for, I believe, 16 years. He doesn't come at the law from an attorney's perspective. He comes at it from that of a special educator. And he has extraordinary knowledge and expertise when it comes to special education law. But like his book, Special Education and the Law, it really speaks to me as an educator, and it helps me to understand the law better. And so I just recommend, in your learning path, go online, look for his materials, because they've just been so beneficial to me over time. And I want to thank our sponsor today, Go Learn. And basically, Let's Go Learn is sponsoring these learning series and series like this Because at Let's Go Learn, the focus is on two primary things. One is improving educational outcomes for students with disabilities, and then the other aspect is legal compliance. And the two are not always completely separate, but at Let's Go Learn, they provide the reporting, the tools, the instruction, all of that to address the issues that we're going to address today. So the goal at Let's Go Learn is to give providers and districts the sorts and the types of tools that allow them to provide educationally meaningful and legally compliant IEPs. So with that said, let's just jump in with Dr. Yell here. My first question really starts kind of with the intent of Congress. And, you know, we go all the way back to 1975, Dr. Yell. And can you speak a little bit to the intent of Congress? And what I want you to kind of juxtapose it against is obviously the law has translated into a lot of paperwork for our teachers. And I know that could not have been their intent. Can you speak to the intent of the law for children?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Kurt. I just wanted to mention, too, that in addition to being a teacher for 16 years and in higher education for 28 now, I'm also a parent of a child with disability. And so I've been on that side of the IEP table, and I'm also a state review officer, or SRO for South Carolina. So in that sense, I'm kind of approaching this from multiple angles, but primarily, as you said, as a special educator. I'm not an attorney, I'm a special educator. And now I know a young fellow like you, Kurt, would not have remembered this, but when I was in school, I don't remember a lot of youngsters with disabilities in my school. And that was because they could be just routinely excluded. A principal could say, no, we don't provide educational services to youngsters in wheelchairs or youngsters with Down syndrome or whatever it may be. So they were routinely excluded from schools. That became, Congress became very aware of those sorts of issues after a couple of major cases that occurred in the early 70s, and decided that there were so much variability between the states in terms of educating youngsters with disabilities that they really needed to have more of a federal standard. And so way back in the early 70s, and even beginning in the late 60s, people in Washington, D.C. started to take really two tracks to try and ensure that youngsters with disabilities would be provided an education. One track was kind of a non-discrimination track. In 1973, a senator from Minnesota and a congressman from Ohio, Hubert Humphrey and Richard Vanek, added Section 504 to the Rehabilitation Act, which really took a non-discrimination approach to educators, saying that persons with disabilities could not be discriminated against. That was not as successful as I think many thought it may be. And so then they took a second track, and that was through an educational grant program passed in 1975, excuse me, called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. And essentially what the federal government said they'd do is they would provide funds to states that would comply with the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which is now, of course, the name was changed to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And what states were required to do to receive these funds is to provide what was called a free appropriate public education for all youngsters with disabilities in public schools. And the essence of free appropriate public education was through this mechanism they developed called the Individualized Education Program, or IEP. And the real intent of the IEP was to individualize educational services, you know, with respect to the unique needs of a child with a disability. And back in 1975, what they did is they developed this IEP, and it wasn't just a document that people were writing, it was a process in which parents of youngsters with disabilities and school-based personnel would get together and develop an individualized program of specially designed instruction for youngsters. So it's really about individualization and educational appropriateness.
So tell me, Dr. Yell, nearly 50 years later, after the enactment of IDEA, where would you say we are today, just based on your experience with school districts around the country? How would you say we're doing relative to the spirit of the law when it comes to individualization?
Well, that is really the crux or the heart of the question. I think that's a very interesting question, because as I said, when the law was first passed, the real notion in passing this law is that they would develop all these different procedures. And we in special ed know of all these procedures we have that are required. You know, we have to send out prior written notice, and we have to have the parents are involved, and we have certain members who have to be on the IEP team. So essentially what Congress originally believed is if school districts just follow the procedures appropriately, they will develop a good educational program. And actually, there was a case in 1982 called Board of Education v. Rowley that started at the IEP team level, went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And essentially what the Supreme Court did is they said, well, this new law, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, really consists of two major components. The first is a procedural component with all these different procedures that we know we special educators have to adhere to. And the second is what they call the substantive component. That is, our educational programs must confer benefit on a child with disabilities. And so we had really two parts of the law according to the Supreme Court. And in fact, they developed a test that school districts and hearing officers and courts could use to determine if a school had offered a free appropriate public education. The first part of the test was, did the school district follow the procedures of the law? And remember, that's what Congress really figured, that, well, if they just follow the procedures, we'll have a good IEP. But then the second part of the test, according to the Supreme Court, was the IEP reasonably calculated to provide benefit to the child. We've never had a problem, or well, we've had problems in the schools with procedures, but that had never been difficult for the courts to figure out. Did the school follow the procedures? They just look at what the procedures say, look what the school district did, and kind of match those together and determine if a school did. The other part, the second part, the substantive part, was a lot more difficult because courts had to determine, well, did the child make benefit? And courts were all over the map and had a really difficult time with that. And it made it very likely that eventually the Supreme Court would have to hear a case on that, which they did in 2017 in a case called Andrew F. v. Douglas County School District. And what the Supreme Court said is, back in 1980, we did answer the procedural part and what that entails, but the more difficult part is before us now. How do we know if an IEP is reasonably calculated to provide benefit? And so what they said is, in fact, I was at the Supreme Court oral arguments, and I remember one of the justices, Justice Sotomayor, said, the idea clearly requires progress, but the word benefit just is too confusing. We had some courts saying, well, minimal benefit's enough, and others saying, no, it has to be meaningful benefit. So what the Supreme Court did is they said an IEP has to be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. So in other words, they were saying procedurally, we have to write IEPs that really children make progress. That was a lot different than benefit, because progress, of course, implies forward movement and that we can prove that a child is actually making progress. So that's been the part. I think going back to your question is procedurally, we tend to be okay. Substantively, not so much, because many times we just are not able to prove that our programs are resulting in student progress. And so I would say, yes, procedurally, we do a pretty good job. Substantively, it's a different matter.
So let me narrow our focus a little bit more down to the school level, school district level. And because one of the things as we do audits and as we provide consulting to school districts in special education, one of the common themes I see throughout these documents, or some of the many themes that I see, is quite often they aren't reasonably calculated to convert or to demonstrate progress. And a part of these issues I see, Dr. Yell, is, we won't find baselines in the PLAF, which makes it extremely hard, obviously, to set an annual goal that is reasonably ambitious, as the Andrew F. case requires now. So I also see from time to time, quite frankly, the wrong kid's name in the goals. Because of technology, it appears we're able to copy and paste, use drop downs. And what I find is when we look at case manager cases, we will find the same goal in each child's IEP. So what is clear to me is that we don't have always individualization. And then the last point I want to bring up and get your thoughts on is if you can speak to the difference between teacher-made quizzes and tests for progress monitoring versus standardized measures, because I see quite often in the how will this goal be evaluated, they will put 3 and 4 different options down there. And if they use 4 different methods for monitoring progress, how can you accurately measure progress using different scales every time? So, right. and from a compliance standpoint, or for a parent that is challenging how well and reasonably calculated an IEP is, speak to some of these points and what school districts can do to avoid that trend.
Well, that's a great question. I think just echoing some of the things you have just mentioned, Kurt, is number one, we have to, as school districts, conduct relevant and complete assessments that address all of a child's needs, and we have to put those needs in the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance statements. Furthermore, we have to do exactly what you said, and that is that PLAAFP statement should serve as a baseline so we can monitor progress, because if we don't include in that IEP what the child's needs are and where they are currently, how can we possibly show progress? So that's a very important component, using the PLAAFP statement as more or less a baseline. A third thing we have to do is we have to develop measurable annual goals, and they have to be truly measurable. It's not a goal that says will be measured by teacher observation. That is not measurable. There was a famous court case out of Ohio called Kirby v. Cabal, and essentially what the court said is the school district had used every goal said teacher observation. How will it be measured? Teacher observation. And the judge in the case said teacher observation is important information, but it is finally subjective. I mean, my observation may not be the same as your observation. So what we really need to do is have objective measures, including in the IEP. And I think one of the things I think that is really useful in IEPs is, in business for years, they've been talking about SMART goals. I think we can take that acronym SMART and kind of bend it into our own needs. I mean, SMART means goals have to be specific, they have to be measurable. I would say A is ambitious. Goals have to be ambitious, because remember what the real purpose of what Andrew was saying is we have to make progress appropriate in light of a student's circumstances. However, they also have to be reasonable. We don't want our goals that are so out of bounds that they're unlikely to be reached, but we want them to be ambitious but reasonable. And finally, they need to be time bound. I mean, we only have a goal is written for 1 year's time period, and we have to, if we don't have the baseline you were talking about and then have a way to measure it, how can we show progress? And that brings me to the final point in terms of showing progress. Is you're exactly right. Whatever method we use to measure progress has to be something that is consistent. I mean, you can't have different types of teacher-made tests because, you know, I've served as expert witnesses on a couple of cases, and I can tell you an expert can really kind of rip a goal that's not measured, is measured in the way you said apart, because if you're not using a consistent measure, you don't know what you're getting. And there's so many really good informal ways to assess goals, like curriculum-based measures, oral reading fluency. We just need to be consistent in the way we measure. And we have to remember that data are words, not numbers. So, I mean, excuse me, numbers, not words. So teacher observation is not a way to measure. Collecting curriculum-based measurements using oral reading fluency data, that is a measure. And then finally, I would say, and I said finally before, but I would also say our IEPs have to be consistent. So they have, in terms of the present levels, leads to goals or services or both, and then we have to monitor progress. And all that has to be consistent. And I can tell you, as a hearing officer, I have seen IEPs that are just not internally consistent. Like there might be a need in the present levels, and it's not addressed further in any place else in the IEP. You have an illegal IEP. It's not internally consistent. So I think we have to work really hard at the substantive piece.
So, couple observations, Dr. Yell, and again, this comes from my working with a lot of special education districts across the country and supporting them in their growth process. But, you know, to me, it gets fairly simple. We have this very large document with a schedule of services and all sorts of services, autism supplements in some states. But it seems to me that the real legal component for the educators, the teachers, the people developing these components come down to 3 areas that are super critical: the present level, the annual goals, and then the progress monitoring. One, not only the development of how you're going to measure it, but the collection of that data. Yeah. And so a lot of the training we do at Let's Go Learn is around those 3 aspects. Would you agree that for a district, you know, for a SPED director, there's just this world and mountain of stuff they could focus on? Would you say, to really ensure educational quality as well as legal compliance, that if you focus your training for your special ed teachers and other teachers and educators in those 3 areas, that you would be making a strong step forward? Or would you also recommend immediate training in other areas?
Well, I mean, you know, there are other trainings, but I think those 3 areas are absolutely really the crux of the whole issue. So if we think back to the Supreme Court's decision in 2017, and Andrew, what did they say? They said to meet the substandard standards of the idea, an IEP has to be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of his or her circumstances. But also very interesting is another quote in the decision where they said, in a hearing or a court, an official, a school official, may be asked, how did you reach your decision that a child's IEP was reasonably calculated? So in other words, what they said is a hearing officer or a judge can ask a school district official to answer this question, and they can expect what the court called a cogent and reasoned explanation for why the IEP was actually enabled the child to make progress. Well, if a principal is on the stand or a special ed director and you're asked, how did this IEP result in student progress? and you don't have any data to show that, that's going to be a problem. So it's so important, I think, that those three things exactly are the issue. We have to have good, solid four issues, good, solid assessments. You have to have a present level statement that can serve as a baseline, a measurable annual goal that's actually measurable and measured. And I think to be measurable, you should be able to graph it. And then you have to have some sort of data collection system that hopefully uses a graphing. You have a graphing function where you can actually show student progress. If a administrator was on a stand and had that kind of information, I think you could say very easily, yes, you can give a cogent and responsive explanation. So I think those three issues you actually hit on the real important issues.
Well, so with the intent of remaining really practical for our practitioners in the field, let's talk a little bit start with the PLAF. And if you're a special ed director, you're over the district and you're concerned about two things: quality of the IEP for your children, as well as legal compliance to protect the district, which is a part of your job. When it comes to the PLAF, what are the key elements that you're going to really train hard on and what they should really ensure is there? Because I will tell you, Dr. Yell, I see incredible variance in PLAFs across the country. From some have positives and negatives, some are qualitative, some are a little more quantitative, some don't match the goals, very few match the goals, and it's all over the place. So what advice can you give about building high quality educational PLAFs that are also legally compliant?
Well, I appreciate you bringing that up too, because this is legal compliance is obviously very important, but what is really important is, are our children making progress? Are we putting together really good programs for children? And I think in terms of the PLAF, you need to have the need statement. What are the child's needs? And all of the child's needs, doesn't matter what their disability is. If they have a behavioral need, that needs to be there. If they have a communication need, that is to be there. I also think, as we talked already, they need to serve as a baseline. So you know where the child is starting at the beginning of the year. You write the measurable goals, and you can see on a frequent systematic measurement, you collect your data and say, well, yes, the child is making progress. I also think one of the things that's often overlooked is the present levels statement also has to have something in there about how that is affecting the child's performance in the general education curriculum.
And let me ask you specifically about that, Dr. Young. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I will tell you, in the last 100 IEPs I've reviewed this year, none of them had a statement about how the disability affects a child. And I'll give you an example. If I have a child with severe dyslexia, and obviously in reading and ELA, it's going to affect them. But a part of what I also want to read is, when they get to social studies, does it make it harder for them to read core content text, and therefore the acquisition of knowledge for social studies is more difficult? Communication skills in class, small group, how does it play out in these environments so that can then align appropriate services and supports for that kiddo? And that seems to be an enormous missing piece. Can you talk about that?
Well, yeah, I think you're absolutely right, because so the child is dyslexic and has the reading problem. That's going to affect math. It's going to affect reading. It's going to affect social studies, health, and anything that requires reading. So that's where you put that information in, because once you have information in the present levels, you have to address it. If a child is in need in the present levels, you either have to have a service to address that need, a goal to address that need, or both, but you always have to have a service. So let's just say, use your example, if we're putting in a present level performance in reading, and we say, okay, how is this affecting the child's performance in reading? It's not only just about reading, it's going to affect his or her performance in social studies. How are we going to provide a service to the social studies to address that need? Well, one way might be you know, that we're going to have a peer read test to the child, or we're going to give the child notes, or whatever we might choose. But if you listed in the present levels that the child's social studies are affected, you wouldn't have a goal on that, but you could have a modification that will be done in social studies class that would directly relate to that need, and that was listed in the present level statement.
Well, and my concern is always because, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's in federal law that it actually says we have to address that within the PLAF. Is that accurate?
Absolutely, yes.
So my concern is if an IEP gets challenged, my message to the district is always, you know, gang, we're not even addressing how it affects the child in these courses, and that could be a real red flag moving forward. So we want to at least get a statement in there and standardize that a little bit for our teachers. Kind of moving forward on the same intention of being practical. So another area of concern that I see is we have the PLAF, then we go to goals. And quite often, again, within one case manager, I'll see the same standards-based goals for each child. And what I might see, like for ELA reading, keeping with the dyslexic child, is I might see inferencing as a focus for every child. And so my question is, and what I want to see special educators asking of their teachers is, and people ask me all the time, how do you decide what goal to use? And I always say, whatever will meaningfully move this child forward in the gen ed curriculum. And to me, I think of like oral reading fluency, I think of comprehension. There are some areas, if you can't read, you know, fluently and you can't understand what you're reading, those are the two key areas. So I say focus on those areas.
Yes.
But how can we help educators determine the annual goals and ensure that they're linked back to that present level?
You know, I think there's a problem. I think a lot of teachers understand. I have a friend of mine, Jim Schreiner, often talks about the importance of standards-based IEPs, but he also always says standards inform your goals. They don't drive your goals. So in other words, if inferencing is a standard, but the child can't even read, clearly you have to be working on that. So the goals, even though there is standardization, we refer to the standards, we have to be addressing the child's needs foremost. That's a foremost thing we have to do in writing our goals. And we just refer back to the present levels. One of the things I wanted to say real quickly too, in terms of measurable goals, is way back when I was an undergraduate, there was a fellow who wrote a book called Preparing Instructional Objectives. Robert Mager was his name. And back in 1972, he had developed a way to write objectives that I think was a perfect way for special educators to write objectives. And he said there needs to be three components to a measurable objective, and what we would call a measurable goal now. And one is you have to have a visible target behavior. It's something that a person can see and count. We have to have a way to measure that behavior, and then we have to have a criterion for acceptable performance. If you don't have those three, you really don't have you can't measure the goal. And what we always say to folks is try and graph your goal. Put down your present levels of performance and then try and graph your goal. If you can't graph it, it's probably not measurable.
That's really, that's great and so critical. And it's interesting, Dr. Yell, and one of the reasons I wanted you to talk about intent is sometimes I think we get lost in legal compliance and paperwork, and we forget the basic intent of an IEP, which is just to find their deficits, put a plan in place, put some goals in place, and then measure how that kiddo does over the year. And sometimes we overcomplicate it. And that kind of takes me to my next area of progress monitoring. I will often see these really flowery goals that some of these software systems develop and the teachers will select. But what I'm also seeing is this habit of, in 3 or 5 trials during each grading period, Stephen will demonstrate proficiency at 80% in comprehension. Well, they've just set the district up for 3 to 5 separate measurement periods every 6 to 9 weeks. And my thing is, keep it simple. Measure once. You can measure more if you want, but now that teacher is going to be held compliant for all of those measurements, and we'll have to demonstrate the documentation of the implementation of that goal. So can you give some recommendations when you're writing a goal for simple, straightforward, and accurate measurement, what you think needs to go into that goal, and then how we might measure it, again, simply, quickly, and intently?
Well, and that's a good point. And I think to understand there's a difference between formative and summative evaluation. The goals are really about summative evaluation. So in other words, what we're doing is it's like we're taking a snapshot of a child's performance at the end of the goal to see if they've measured the goal. But of course, that is not nearly enough to ensure that a child is receiving an education actually making progress. For that, we need formative evaluation, where teachers are gathering data on a frequent and systematic basis throughout the year and comparing the child's performance on where they want the child to be and ask themselves, are they making progress toward that goal? So that formative evaluation is very important. And there's so many different ways we can do that through curriculum-based measures, curriculum-based assessments. Really, it's very important we choose real user-friendly ways to do that, because we teachers are pretty busy folks. And so if we can quickly take a measure and then make that assessment, analyze our data, that would be formative evaluation. Then the end of the year, if we just have our snapshot, like you were using the term 80% accuracy, or let's say we're using oral reading fluency, at the end of the year, Johnny will read aloud 102 words per minute with less than 2 errors. And so at the end of the year, you essentially take that snapshot. That tells you, has the child met the goal, but you have to have that formative data collected throughout the year.
So Dr. Yell, what are the expectations of a school district? And let's say the special ed directors put in some really good training, they're progress monitoring, they have measurable goals, but let's say they get to the end of the first 9 weeks, no progress. Second 9 weeks, no progress. What is the responsibility of the school district? Do they need to make an adjustment and hold an IEP meeting, or do they wait till the end of the year and not adjust the intervention or instruction?
Well, of course, that's really, I remember when I first started teaching in Minnesota, one of the things we did is we would really write our present levels as a baseline, and then we wait till the end of the year and take the measure our goal. And what could we do? I mean, if we said, oh goodness, the child didn't make progress, there's another year that nothing has happened, that's totally inappropriate. So we have to use that formative data collection during the year to help inform us. So what we don't have to have an IEP meeting, but the teacher should be collecting that data, or their paraprofessional, anybody that can do that, and they should be making ongoing decisions regarding, do I need to change a child's educational program? That doesn't mean you have a whole IEP meeting again. It just means that you would contact the parent and you could talk about, well, we're going to be adding or changing instruction in this way. But yeah, I think we have to, it's like my old advisor Stan Dino used to say, it's like when you go to a doctor and say, I went to a doctor because I had a knee problem. What's the first thing they do? They put you on a scale, they take your blood pressure, they take your temperature. Why? Does that have anything to do with your knee? No, but they have a baseline of your physical health. And if something's going awry, like all of a sudden my blood pressure is way up, they know to do something. That's what formative evaluation does. It's allowing us to take a measure of a child's educational health, and if we see problems, we can do something about it immediately. That's why data collection is so important. Nope, we kind of lost you there, Kurt. I'm not here.
So, sorry about that, Dr. Yell. I have one more question before we go to questions from the audience, and so I'll get you off the hot seat here. Can you tell me, from your professional experience and review of case law, you know, and what I want you to talk about the most common errors you see that lead to substantive issues, FAPE violations. You know, if you're a special education director, what are the areas you're really going to focus on right now for PD to support your teachers and protect your school district?
I would say, number one, present levels as a baseline statement. Number two, teaching them how to write, teaching measurable annual goals. I mean, a lot of, you know, as you looked at hundreds of IEPs I have, and I am not seeing that many truly measurable goals. So we have to be able to teach train our teachers in writing measurable annual goals using those three criteria that Mager said in 1962 are important in writing measurable objectives. And then lastly, you've got to collect data and you've got to keep it. You've got to use the data, because let's say a child, remember, courts don't expect you to absolutely meet all your goals. They expect that you're going to a child is going to make progress, and you're going to make good faith efforts to ensure that a child is making progress. And that's the way we do it. So number one, present levels is a baseline. Number two, writing measurable annual goals using those three components. Number three, collecting data, simple, user-friendly ways of collecting data, and then actually using it. In the hearings, excuse me, Kurt, but you know, in the hearings that I've done, that the biggest problems, and when I served as an expert witness, one of the first things I always look for is the goal measurable, and they're actually collecting data on it. And oftentimes, even when they have measurable goals, there's no evidence of data being collected. That is going to be a problem for school districts.
So it reminds me real quick of if you can kind of go back to a quote, and I believe it was you, Dr. Yell, in another webinar. And because it caught my eye, because I remember sitting across the table from her when I worked in Virginia. But you referenced, I believe, Ms. Mayford, a very well-known special education attorney who represents school districts. And you asked her, you know, when you settle a case, essentially, what motivates you? Why would you settle, or what set of circumstances would lend you to settle versus fight?
Well, you know, I can give you her exact quote, because I first heard it at a conference in 2015. Now, by the way, 2 years before Andrew.
Yeah.
And you have to remember, Kathleen Mayfed worked with an attorney in Virginia, a firm in Virginia, was exclusively represented school districts. Yep. And what she said is, when I have a school district with a FAPE case, the first thing I do is go to the teacher and say, give me information on your student's progress. Where's your data? If the teacher doesn't have data, I strongly consider advising the school district to settle. Because if you can't prove a child has made progress, you can't prove any substantive benefit. And remember, that's what Andrew was all about. And she said that 2 years before Andrew. So I think that's even more the case now.
And I think that's powerful, Dr. Yell, because it seems to me, and just listening to you and reading your books, special education is one gigantic cookie. And for a special education director that's trying to do training in special education, you can't eat the giant cookie in one bite. You have to choose areas of priority. And it seems to me, looking at progress, data, tracking, those are huge areas of focus. You mentioned the PLAF, annual goals, progress monitoring. And so I guess that's my advice, and my takeaway from you, again, is don't try and eat that entire cookie. Take a couple pieces that are super important, focus there, and you'll make enormous strides to protecting your district and supporting children in the learning process if you focus on those few areas.
Absolutely true. There was you said that reminds me very much of a case called Rutland South Supervisory Union, where the hearing officer called the IEP an intricate puzzle that's pieced together by the efforts of teachers, parents, school staff, and other professionals. And how that puzzle is constructed is crucial, and missing pieces jeopardize the whole picture. And so if you're missing a piece like the data collection, you've really jeopardized the whole FAPE concept.
Wow. So at this point, Dr. Yell, we'd like to open it up to some of our special educators around the country who are sitting in with us today. And Candice, were you going to wade through some of these questions and present them to Dr. Yell, or was there a different plan?
Yeah, well, we have a couple of questions here, and one of you guys can take the reins on as far as answering. But the first question we have is, how often should you complete formative assessment for a goal to measure the goal? Should it be weekly? Should it be bi-weekly? What are your recommendations?
That's a really good question. My answer would be the same answer that Standino used to give, and that is collect it as much as you can. If you can do it once a month, oh, that's a minimum. If you can do it once a week, that's even better. If you can do it 3 times a week, that's better. That's why I think, because we know the more information or data you have, the better your decision making is going to be. And if we can choose formative evaluation systems that are really practitioner friendly, something the teacher can do in 2 minutes. I remember when I was a teacher, I used to do CBM because I was from Minnesota and Stan Dino had invented curriculum-based measurement. I would have my para doing independent reading with kids, and I'd take them one aside and take a 2-minute oral reading fluency measure, and then they go back. I do that for all my students. It'd take 10 minutes, and yet I have data that can really, it's not only legally compliant if I have that data, but it's making a real difference. People like the Fuchs have done meta-analysis that shows that teachers that collect data generally have greater student achievement. In fact, 1 standard deviation greater student achievement than teachers that don't collect and use data. So I would say do it as often as you can, but at least it should, I like to see it done once a week for formative purposes.
Awesome. The next question is, can you repeat the 3 components when writing measurable annual goals? What were those 3 components again?
Well, I always keep this right by my side. You can't see it because it's going to be backwards, but it's preparing instructional objectives. That book was $1.75 when I bought it for my undergraduate, when I was an undergraduate student. Robert Mager, interesting guy. Robert Mager was an efficiency expert with the US Air Force, I believe. And he developed a way to, because he was an efficiency expert, a way for his people working under him to write their goals in terms of things like taking care of equipment, things like that. And he said there's 3 elements you have to have a measurable goal. You have to have a target behavior. And by that, I mean reading aloud, writing sentences, something you can see, a visible target behavior. That's number 1. Number 2, you have to have a way to measure that. Barbara Bateman used to call that a given. Given a story starter in 3 minutes to write a story. And the last thing the third thing you have to have is criterion for acceptable performance. And that is, when do you know the child has met the goal? Well, if you set a goal that the child is going to read 104 words per minute, that would be your criterion for acceptable performance. Or using Kurt's example, if you have something with 90% accuracy, that would be a criterion for acceptable performance. So target behavior, number 1, target behavior, number 2, a given or a measurement, how you're going to measure, number 3, criterion for acceptable performance.
Okay.
And by
Awesome.
the way, I should say we do have some colleagues and I do have a book coming out called IEPs Developing Educationally Meaningful and Legally Sound IEPs, and that Mager's method is included in that, writing goals. And I also do have to take this little time. I have a blog, and I'm hoping someday I can get Kurt to do a contribution to it. Very simple, spedlawblog.com, SPEDLAWBLOG. And we, about every other week, we'll have a new case on there. We address that. And since I'm so interested in this 3-step method, I will look on the blog next week. I'll put this 3-step method down. I think it's a really good way to ensure your goals are measurable. Without doing that, you really can't show that they're measurable.
Did you have any other pressing questions, Candice?
Just a couple more. There's a question about the school's use of technology programs that measure progress. Is that considered SDI?
I didn't quite get the last part.
So if a school is using a technology-based program to measure progress, does that count as an SDI, specially designed instruction?
Well, it's a measurement tool. There have been a lot of really good technological measurement tools developed. I know Lynn and Doug Fuchs have a couple. There's a number of really good ones out there that you can use, and it's not really the instruction or the SDI. What it really is, it's your measurement tool. It's your way to formatively evaluate progress.
Well, and let me ask this, Dr. Yell, because they might be referring to this technology. There's like Let's Go Learn, for example. It diagnoses where the kiddo is in mathematics and reading, and then it provides specific instruction on that kiddo's grade level to then teach them, and then it'll measure again and have formative assessment. But I think they're asking if you provide deficit-based, specific to the kiddo, if you provide instruction digitally that's specific to where that kiddo is diagnostically, can that be counted as SDI?
Oh, yeah, if that's an instructional component, absolutely, yes, absolutely. But the good point there is not only is instructional provided, but you're also monitoring and measuring progress. So you're really, getting that formative data you need too.
The other thing I want to add, Dr. Yell, is that, when you really think about some of our models like inclusion, I was an inclusion teacher for a long time, did that. A lot of times you're in the back of the classroom waiting to do something to help, waiting to help organize a child, waiting to support them in a quiz or test. It's not always specially designed. And when I think of where the technology is today, that's probably actually a better example, because I think the intent of specially designed instruction was to truly identify and analyze the kids' needs and then instruct them where they are. Whereas again, inclusion supports is not always what I would consider truly specially designed instruction. That's probably, and so this person that asked the question, I think it's a great question. And again, technology allows us to do that today.
Okay, yes, absolutely, absolutely agree.
Okay, so what I'd like to do, we've only got a few minutes left, and one of the things we're going to do today is just make available to you guys. It's completely optional, and we put it on the end in case you want to hop off and need to get back to your kiddos. But we're going to do a quick demo or highlights of Let's Go Learn system, and basically the system has been built to provide legal compliance as well as meaningful education to kiddos based on special education needs. So again, it addresses the PLAF, it addresses annual goals, short-term objectives, progress monitoring, and all of the major elements. And we really take our guide from professionals like Dr. Yell and listen to what they have to say, and then we introduce reports and refinements based on, again, the direction of the experts in the field. So if you'd like to stay on, feel free to. One of our team members is going to hop on here, and Dr. Yell, you're more than welcome to hang around in case somebody has a deep question about the law. But if you have to go, I understand that as well.
No, absolutely. I do want to hang around. I just wanted to say, if people do have questions, please feel free to email me. I'll be happy to answer.
And I was going to say to that point, lastly, on the last slide of the demo, there's going to be Dr. Yell's email as well as my email. Dr. Yell provides consulting and supports all over the country. We also provide consulting and supports to school districts. So if you need support in this area or need training, again, feel free to contact either one of us, because a part of our mission is to help the special educators out there who are doing the hard work every day in the schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So just a couple of highlights. Our assessments are standard based, and you'll have really granular data. That data will help you pinpoint the student's zone of proximal development in multiple areas, and then you'll be able to identify the student's present levels. And once you have those present levels, it'll make it a lot easier for you to write your instructional goals for the students. And we also incorporate progress monitoring. So you're able to take the full assessment and break it up into smaller quizzes and subtests. That way you can progress monitor throughout the year. And we do this using a diagnostic model. So you'll see we test in 6 different areas in reading, and you'll get a grade level equivalency score in each of those subtests. So that way you're really able to pinpoint what areas the student is struggling in and what areas they are strong in. And with math, we get even more granular. We'll test 44 subtests, and you're going to get a score in each of those subtests. Now, without further ado, I do want to pass it over to Candice Williams, who is a customer success specialist here, so that she can show you some of our great reporting features.
Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Your screen.
Okay, absolutely, awesome. So this is our teacher interface here on the screen right now, and there's a ton of support built in for you. But for the purpose of the day, we want to just give a quick visual into what the scores and reports will look like once your students take the assessment. So what will happen is, and I'm going to go into the math portion of the assessment, once the students take a comprehensive diagnostic or a sub-skill diagnostic, all of their data will flow into this portal. It's called the Active Pulse. And here on the screen right now, I'm on the math screen. You will see that it is showing a summary of various skills. And you immediately we have access to, excuse me. You immediately have access to the student's total score, as well as their scores in each of the major strands in math. So for example, here, this is not. Okay, I can look at the student Billy Payne. I can see immediately that he's a 7th grade student. His total score right now is a 3.82, which is showing that Billy currently is performing as a 3rd grader in the 8th month of school. In addition to that total score, I can see the breakout of each of his individual strand scores. So if I hover over these headings, I get the categories or the strands for the math assessment. I see numbers and operations, measurement, data analysis, geometry, algebraic thinking. And then I can see Billy's score or grade level equivalency score in each of those areas. So he's a 3.6 in numbers and operations, 4.8, which is 4th grade mid-year for measurement, so on and so forth. If I wanted to break it down into the particular skills that are tied to these strands, I can see the titles here, but I also have each strand up here at the top, and I can click into that strand. And then I'm taken to a screen that shows me a breakdown of the skills associated with that strand. And so I can see numbers, place value, orders, operations, addition, subtraction, so on and so forth for all of the skills associated with numbers and operation. And then I get a grade level score for each of those skills per student. All right, so immediately I can identify students that have the greatest need. And then from this information, we have several reporting options, but one of them that I wanted to show you today is an individual report. You have this available for not only students that are receiving special services, but this report is available for all your students. But we have this report called the Special Education Tool. It's our IEP writing tool. And so if I click into that, right now I'm looking at the students' math scores. I immediately have access to all the student personal information at the time of testing. And in addition to that, one of the best features of this report is that you have immediate access to all the students' present levels in each of the major strand areas. And so immediately I can use this information to begin to set my baselines, to begin to write my annual goals for that student, and this information can go directly into the student class. And so you can copy and paste any of this information on this report directly into your draft IEP. In addition to that, I can identify the areas that I want to focus on with the student. I immediately see the student has a need in numbers and operations. Once again, this is a 7th grade student. They're at a 3.6 in numbers and operations. I can scroll down. If I choose a different strand, I'm currently viewing numbers and operations, but if I choose to view a different strand, then I can immediately click into the other strands that are available. But what I see here for numbers and operations is right now I'm viewing the student present levels. Okay, so what this report does for you is it takes that strand and it breaks down into each of the skills and gives you the student's present level for each particular skill that were assessed in that strand. It gives you the present level written in goal-friendly language. It gives you the grade level equivalency score that aligns to the present level. It also gives you the standard that aligns to that present level. And then it gives you the grade level standard that we are working towards. And so it's going to give you that alignment here for you. So it takes that guesswork out of trying to figure out how this aligns to what they're supposed to be doing based on grade level. In addition to that, you can take this standard code and you can put it into the state lookup tool, and then you can look up the standard right here within the tool. So you don't have to go searching into another platform to find what the standard code means. You can do it right here. So I have my present levels. Say that place value is an area that I want to focus on for the student. I can then recalibrate this page to change from the present levels to show me what my next instructional steps are, so I can begin to write my plan. So here at the top, if I click instructional skills to display, I can choose up to 10 of the next steps per skill. And so say that I want to see the next 3 steps for this student. I want to set some incremental goals for this student. So I click 3 for the 3 instructional steps, click refresh. And this is going to allow me to now see the next instructional steps for that student in each area. Each next step shows the grade level equivalency score that aligns to that next step. It also shows the standard that aligns to that next step, as well as keeps that grade level alignment for you so you know what you're always working towards. In addition to that, down here at the bottom, if you are working in our Edge platform, you'll be able to track all of the interventions that the student completes within the system. So it'll track by date, it'll put the lessons there for you, as well as the student score, and then it will timestamp it for you. So any interventions they complete within our program, it's going to track all that there for you so you can make sure you're in compliance as far as how many minutes of intervention the student should be receiving each week. Okay?
Hey, Candice?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, if you can scroll down a little bit. Just right there. The other piece and the way this was designed is as well, you know, Andrew F. said that it has to be reasonably ambitious. So what we've done, if you look under place value, comparing and ordering, these are all the subheadings of the major heading of numbers and operations. And we know that's a low area that the child needs to focus on. So you can set a goal, and it's all goal language, as you'll see there. So-and-so will identify place value for 3-digit numbers, very specific, very explicit, and it lets you know what it would take or where they are right now at that level or the next level. So if you want them to go to 2.9, you could set that goal. If you want to be a little more ambitious, 3.5 or 3.9. It depends on how ambitious you want to be, and then you can just copy and paste the language, and it's going to give you the goal as well as their baseline for the child. Now, the other thing you can do is if we go back one to where we had the present level. Again, it's very similar. If we go here again, it's telling you exactly where they were. So let's say place value is of considerable concern because it's at 1.9. Well, you may decide that you want 1.5 years of growth. So you might say, you know, this child will identify place value in two-digit numbers and will get a grade equivalent score of 3.5. Your baseline would go into the PLAF as 1.9, and then you would progress monitor place value in the system. So essentially, it's going on the principles of triangulating the PLAF, the annual goals, and the short-term or the progress monitoring to ensure it's all connected. So we designed the reporting to make it super easy and quick to do that.
Okay. Absolutely. And the last thing that I want to show, so just like Kurt said, you can utilize this to set up, you know, what you're actually going to be monitoring for that student. But once you begin to monitor that student and you're giving them their formative assessments, what you'll be able to do here is once they've taken the comprehensive diagnostic, you set your baselines, and then you've chosen your areas to progress monitor. Anytime the student takes an assessment, it's going to feed into this progress monitoring section of your site. And then what will happen is all of their assessment data will be tracked here. And then what you're allowed to do here is you can select the assessments that you need to see as far as the progress monitoring testing windows that you've completed. You can select those here. And then once you click chart, it's going to be able to graph all those different testing windows and show the student progress throughout each of those. In addition to that, you'll have all of the student scores for each of the individual strand areas. You also can break this graph down even more to the specific skill. Okay. And these are all, you're able to print any of these. Okay.
You know, I think
Anything you want to add on this one?
Andrew S. said a school official may need to give a cogent and responsive explanation for why they determine that it is intended to make progress, intended for the child to make progress. That's your cogent and responsive explanation right on the screen right now. I think that would be very compelling data in a hearing or a court case.
Agreed.
All right, anything else you would like for me to share today?
No, I think we're good, and I want to be sensitive to everybody's time. And I don't know if our CEO, Richard Capone, is available, if he just has any last minute comments he'd like to make to all of our listeners and folks that joined with us today.
Sure, I just want to thank Dr. Yell for agreeing to present with us in these next 3 webinars. So we're real excited to have you here. And, you know, our goal is really to give everyone, you know, in the field information to how to help you do your difficult job. Right down below, you'll see we do have a link for another product demo we'll do on Monday, but also you'll get an email tomorrow listing everything, as well as listing the other webinars with Dr. Yell. So we have lots of great information for you. We'll also summarize all these questions for you, and we'll send out the answers. So thank you so much, Dr. Yell and Dr. Hulett and Christina and Candice.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Too.
Bye-bye.